Welcome back to the FHIR and 5. Today we're up to the letter V, and I thought we would cover FHIR validation. It's a really important part of FHIR, especially when we're developing our FHIR processes or any integration with FHIR. It's important that we validate our data during that process to make sure everything is as expected. So when we validate FHIR resources or our FHIR implementation, what sort of things can we look at validating? If you follow the link there, it'll take you straight to the FHIR website that talks about the areas of validation. And it covers things like the structure of the resource to make sure it looks like the resource that it's supposed to look like. Things like cardinality, so if something's mandatory field within the FHIR resource, have you populated that particular field? If there needs to be a certain number of values, it'll check that cardinality for you. Value domain, so is the terminology that you're using for a particular codable concept or coding record appropriate, and does it contain the values that you're trying to send through? You can also check things like invariants, which are constraints on a particular field. You can also look at bindings, so the terminology that's bound for a particular field, how have you supplied the right values or not to that particular field, especially if we have the bindings of example or required, are they conformant to that particular binding? You can also validate against profiles, so we can say that our particular FHIR resource should be based or is based upon the AU patient resource, and we can validate that yes, it conforms to the requirements, the constraints of that particular profile. We can also validate against multiple profiles, so we might have to conform to AU patient resource, but we might have to also validate against another profile. So we can grab multiple profiles, validate against across those profiles and say yes, it conforms to those. We can also validate questionnaires. So if someone's completed a questionnaire, we've got a sample questionnaire response, we can validate that against the questionnaire that has been created to make sure that the validation of the fields matches what we're expecting to see in the response. We might also want to validate against business rules that are specific to a particular use case. When we look at some of the options for validation, there is a validation operation that's available and supported by some FHIR servers. So we can do the $validate, we can pass it our resource and get feedback as to how it conforms to the various aspects of FHIR. We can use JSON and XML schemas or the XML schematron to go and validate the particular FHIR elements. It's a subset of what would be available from a validation perspective from what you'd get out of $validate, and certainly the validate jar, much more comprehensive. Finally, that FHIR validator jar file that you can use to validate a particular FHIR resource. When we validate against the FHIR validator, it's a command line tool. We can use it in line. We can get all of the feedback from the validator around, might be errors, warnings, informational aspects of our FHIR resource that aren't quite right, with recommendations on what the issue is and where it is in the particular resource that you've got the problem with. The FHIR validator jar file can be run from external tools. So if you're running, I don't know, test scripts or whatever, and you wanted to run the FHIR validator as part of that process, get the feedback and look for certain patterns as part of your automated testing process, you could do that. You just need to think around where you want to include validation as part of your overall implementation of FHIR. The validation process can be quite resource intensive, so you just want to make sure that you're not taking minutes to validate a resource prior to posting this data in the production server. So certainly I recommend it during that sort of early development phase, where you're wanting to make sure that you're conforming to the profiles, your structure's right, the value sets are right. So go with that. When you're doing the validation, we can pick a particular FHIR version that we might want to be validating against. We can also pick specific implementation guides that we want to use as our basis for validation, or a profile. So if I'm saying that I want to validate this patient against the AU profile, AU-based patient profile, I can give it that set of parameters to go off and validate my particular FHIR resource and give me the output that comes back from that validation. Also, when we're looking at terminologies, there's a base terminology that's configured within the validator, pointing to a generic terminology server. You may want to point your particular validator at a different terminology server that's more appropriate for your use case. So maybe the terms that you're using are specific to your use case, are tied into a regional or local terminology server, and so you might want to reference those as part of your implementation. So just in summary, validation is really important when we're dealing with FHIR. Make sure that we've got the right resources and we're conforming to the profiles that we think we're conforming to as part of our implementation. The validator tool is really easy to use. It's not dependent on the capabilities of the FHIR server you're talking to, unlike the $validate operator. So really just go to town on validating your FHIR resources, making sure that they are conformant and that the terminologies and bindings that are appropriate for your particular profile are valid in the data that you're providing. And maybe think about utilizing those automated testing tools in conjunction with the FHIR validator to streamline your DevOps process.